Abigail Adams was, in many respects, the quintessential American Revolutionary War woman. She was born in 1744 in Weymouth, Massachusetts, which is about 14 miles southeast of Boston. She married at the age of 21, which was maybe a little bit old for that time. She was considered almost a spinster in a way. Most women got married in their teens, I would say. She married John Adams, who was 9 years older than her, not so unusual at the time. She had 6 children, 3 of whom died before adulthood. 2 died one was stillborn, and 1 died about a year and a half old. So this was fairly typical that children died early. She was a very sickly child and thus did not go to school in New England. This is a little unusual in New England because most girls did go to school to learn the rudimentaries of reading and also domestic skills. But Abigail was differently educated. She stayed with the same husband for 54 years. They were together before she died. And she lived in a small town in a sort of Cape Cod house, and they ran a farm. She and her husband ran the farm together. She did not go out in the field. He did go out in the field. She assisted in other ways. But although she fits the model of this Revolutionary War woman, in many respects she was different. She was quite unique, and that is because, first of all, she married John Adams, who becomes such an important figure. I remember when I was in Korea in 1987, I was given a party, and the person, my hostess, who hosted this party in Busan, got along very well with the 15 men who were present. She was a woman. And after the party, I asked her how she got along so well with the Korean men, because I had seen how they had discriminated against women. And she told me she was not a woman. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, first of all, I'm an American. And so her status as an American trumped her status as a woman. And that's how it was with Abigail Adams. Her status as Abigail Adams trumped her status as a woman. And so people didn't view her as a woman per se, with all the limitations that implied, but rather they viewed her as a very special person. At first, naturally, they thought of her as the wife of John Adams. But when they got to know her, she became more than that. She became quite a unique individual in her own right. So she was quite special. If you wanted to characterize her in one word, I would say perhaps suffering or long suffering would be a good word for her, because she did. She shared her husband with the country. She realized that not only did she lose the companionship of her husband, but her children lost the father that most children should have. And so I would say long suffering is a good term for her. Whereas with her husband, I would say vanity might be a very good word, although he would picture it differently. He felt he had a consciousness of merit, and therefore that was not an indication of vanity. He really was something special in his own eyes, and I think also in Abigail's eyes. If you would try to find a modern day Abigail Adams, I would say perhaps someone like a Nancy Reagan would be similar to Abigail Adams. And on the opposite side, Martha Washington, who would be a comparable modern day Martha Washington. And I would say perhaps Barbara Bush would meet that comparison. As I mentioned, the correspondence that Abigail Adams really separates her out from most other women at the time. There are some women that have some correspondence, like Mercy Otis Warren, but Abigail has quite an extensive correspondence. She wrote, that we know, over 2,500 letters. Of those 2,500 letters, there's a correspondence, very extensive correspondence with her husband. One of the good things about that separation that they had was they corresponded with each other. One of the things that I'll never forgive Thomas Jefferson for is that he stopped the two of them, Abigail and John, from writing to each other. And he did that by defeating John Adams for the presidency in 1801. And because of that, John Adams went home, and basically John and Abigail were not separated after that. So they did not correspond with each other for 17 years of Abigail's life, the last 17 years, because they were together. They didn't need to write. So that's an unfortunate loss for us. But the correspondence was important. Abigail didn't think so. She, on 4 occasions, asked John to burn the correspondence. She didn't think it was worthwhile. She was somewhat embarrassed at her handwriting, her spelling, and the fact that she jumped around from here or there and didn't maintain a subject for very long. So she didn't think anybody later on should peruse these letters. She was on occasion a bit erotic, and I think she was embarrassed for her husband if that kind of personal references got viewed by other than him. John, on the other hand, said no way that he could destroy her letters. He would have to forget her first, but her letters were like a cannonade to his heart. There are, between the two of them, over 1,160 letters that remain. She filled up her letters, her page. She said that was an important thing, a sign of love and affection. John didn't do that. John was too busy. Abigail, I think, could write a half a page and then set it down and come back to it maybe the next day. So they were more like journal letters than a letter that was written in one sitting. But these letters are available for anyone to see. They're all online, both the manuscript and the transcription of it at the Massachusetts Historical Society. There's also a book that is available, the letters between John and Abigail from the 1750s, when they got acquainted with each other before their marriage, until 1784, when Abigail joins John in London and then in Paris. Abigail's religion, she was a Congregationalist. Her father was a Congregational minister, very prominent and perhaps the wealthiest minister in the state. And he had his church in Weymouth. He married John and Abigail in Weymouth. He was a liberal Congregational minister, not the fire and brimstone, or not the predestination of John Calvin. And Abigail took on many of those beliefs. She evolved toward the end of her life. Both she and John were probably practicing Unitarians. Abigail believed strongly in religion. She cited the Bible a lot in her letters. She also cited, from a literary point of view, I should mention Alexander Pope more frequently than Shakespeare. But in the Bible, she quoted from Psalms, Proverbs. In the Old Testament, you can understand the beauty of those verses. She also cited in the New Testament Matthew, and obviously when there were trying times, she would cite Job. Uh, she believed in the resignation to the will of God, that human beings could not understand the plan that God had, and so because of that, the inscrutable nature of the will of God, we ought to be resigned to it. And yes, we could be saddened when someone died, but we had to get over that fairly quickly. Abigail said that over and over again. It wasn't so easy for her when she was the one suffering the loss of a loved one. She believed that you needed to do good deeds. Good deeds were important. They would be rewarded both here on earth and in the hereafter. She felt that it was important that the Bible be used to cultivate a moral conscience. And so she regularly read the Bible and quoted it and used it in teaching her children. She believed that heaven had a stratified society, and so it was important that you prepare yourself for that. You should be well versed. The most successful people on earth, the most meritorious, would be given a special place in heaven with special accoutrements, because there was a stratified society there, and you could improve yourself in heaven. So if you were given the tools to begin with, you would have a better chance of improving your status in heaven. And she obviously wanted that for herself, but also for her husband and for her children. Fame was an important thing for the founding generation. They felt that was important to obtain fame, not popularity, but fame to show that you were a good citizen, that you had run a good life, and you should be remembered for the things that you accomplished. Abigail compared that with God. God was interested in fame. He requires in the Ten Commandments that there be no other gods before the one and only God. And so it was important for individuals to seek that kind of fame. It had made a celestial connection between the individual and God, desiring this kind of justifiable fame. Abigail was very much involved in the revolutionary movement. She helped her husband along and participated after the war. Many years later, John wrote to Benjamin Rush and said during those trying days of 1770 and later, it was certainly the time that tried not only men's souls, but women as well, in alluding to how important Abigail was in supporting the revolutionary movement. Perhaps in the 1760s or so, there might have been only 3 people in colonial America that favored independence, and they all had the same last name, Abigail, John, and Samuel Adams. And so Abigail pushed John when he was in the first and second Continental Congresses that they should be voting on independence. John wrote back regularly saying, you can't push this. You can only go as a certain speed. He compared it to a horse and carriage. You might have 4 or 6 horses. The carriage can only go as fast as the slowest horse. And so that was their situation. But Abigail said that she was all in favor of this revolution. When reports of defeat came along, she was supportive of the army. And she said if the British come back to Massachusetts, they would meet with an army of Amazons that the women would be fighting. In the course of advocating for independence, Abigail also wrote her most famous letter, a letter that calls for John to remember the ladies, that when they were going to declare independence from Great Britain, they ought to make sure that women had protections. She wasn't advocating suffrage. She certainly would have liked for women to have the voting rights, but she wanted protections, court protections, legal protections, property rights, things of that nature, things that she was doing de facto because her husband was gone. She wanted women to have those rights in American society. As I was preparing a short biography of Abigail Adams, a friend of mine mentioned there was an article in a prominent historical magazine saying that Abigail was threatening John with a divorce. And I said that was just impossible. I'd read all the letters, never saw it. And so he pressured me to look at this article because it quoted the letters between John and Abigail. And Abigail was saying to John, our marriage is a sacred thing. But we're bound together by God. And if you're not home within the next year, I, however, want a divorce from you. And I just thought that was impossible. And so I did read the article and I checked the historical sources and I saw through the use of ellipses what they had done. And what Abigail said was indeed she did hold their marriage as sacred and she was very tied to her husband. And she said, I miss you terribly. If you're not back within the year, I will come to you. She didn't say, I want a divorce. She said, I will come to you, even though I fear the travel on the ocean and I don't want to leave my friends and family behind, but I love you so much and I think you need me, so I would come to you. And that's what she did in 1784. She, along with her daughter, her only daughter, they traveled with two servants to England, and there met her son, first of all, John Quincy Adams, who had grown from a little boy to now a grown man. He had been 11 when he left. Now he's 16. And eventually John joins them. And they move from London, where she was temporarily staying, to the outskirts of Paris. So she lived in Paris for almost a year and then moved to London, where she stayed for about 3 years almost. She became accustomed to both of those places. She did not care for Paris at first. She thought it was dirty, and she didn't like the loose morals that were there. She didn't know the language. That was a problem for her. But by the time she was about ready to leave, I think she changed. And I think she really did enjoy Paris. She enjoyed going to the theater. She said, given another 6 months, she would have been very well situated language-wise, and she'd be able to communicate with the French language. So she lived in a fairly substantial chateau in the outskirts of Paris. And when she moved to London, she lived also in a fairly substantial home. She needed servants in those homes. Abigail Adams always had slaves or servants in her family. Slaves only when she lived with her father. Her father owned several slaves. When her father died, he freed those slaves. Abigail and John never owned any slaves. They had servants, usually two servants at home in Braintree, but in Paris and in London and in Philadelphia and New York, she had many more. She might have 8 to 10 servants at different times. She didn't particularly care for her servants. She had a black cook once, and she did not care for her, and she said, "I'll never have another black cook again." Well, it took about a year or so later, and she wrote, "I'll never have another white cook again." So it wasn't the race that she was objecting to. She just didn't. She had problems with servants, and she felt that they were always wanting. Whenever she got a very competent servant, she was eager to keep that servant on, and she did keep several of the servants for a long time. Uh, Abigail was strongly opposed to slavery. She could not understand how people in America could fight for their independence and yet keep a race of individuals in slavery. So she strongly opposed slavery. She was approached. Well, I should say she had a very close tie with a slave that was freed by her father, Phoebe. Phoebe, when she's freed, gets married and to William Abney. So Phoebe Abney is a very close person to Abigail Adams. When John Adams's mother died, that was the last of the parents, of the four parents. Abigail wrote to John, "We only have one parent left, and that's Phoebe." And so she considered this black woman as sort of a surrogate mother in many respects. And so when Abigail left to go to Europe in 1784, she said that Phoebe and William Abney should live in their house. Many people objected to that in Braintree, but that was done. When they came back, they assisted Phoebe. Her husband had died, and so Abigail helped Phoebe get residence and helped Phoebe financially through the rest of Phoebe's life, even though that was quite a strain on Abigail. Abigail had a couple indentured servants. It's not too widely known. One was named James, a 15-year-old, and he wanted to enroll in a nightly school that boys could join in. They would learn accounting, and so Abigail said that was fine. It didn't take long before one of the parents came to see Abigail and said maybe it would be a good thing if James didn't attend the school. That some of the other boys were not pleased with James. Well, Abigail said, is he disruptive? No. Is he slow and he's slowing down the other boys? No. Well, you know. And Abigail said, no, I don't know. And if there's a problem, she said, I, in fact, have taught James to read and write in my own parlor. If there's a problem, let somebody come to me and tell me about the problem. No one ever did. Another indentured servant, Prince, also went to school, and no problem seemed to have occurred with him. Abigail became John's closest political advisor. This is true throughout their marriage, but it's particularly true when they come back from Europe. And I think at that point in time, because Abigail no longer had the maternal responsibilities of raising children, she could concentrate more on politics. And I think she greatly enjoyed politics. Plus, she also thought that her husband and her son, John Quincy Adams, needed her support. And so she was quite influential in that regard. In politics, when John was vice president, he faced opposition to being reelected vice president in 1792. And then in the election of 1796, which was the first contested presidential election, John faced a challenge from Thomas Jefferson. During these political contests, there were a lot of immigrants that had come to America, particularly from France because of the French Revolution, and from Ireland. And all of these, in the eyes of Abigail, seemed to be Jeffersonians. And so she advocated throughout the early 1790s for a more stringent immigration policy, a more difficult Alien Act that would lengthen the time for citizenship, let's say, for naturalization. She also was quite adamant in her opposition to sedition, what she called sedition. And so she advocated sedition laws at the federal level. And so in 1798, she was a staunch advocate for the alien and sedition laws. And without her strenuous support, it's doubtful in my mind that John Adams would have signed the alien and sedition laws. But he did, and it was probably the most detrimental thing that he did throughout his presidency. In 1804, Jefferson lost his younger daughter. He had been a widower since 1784. He and his wife had 6 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. And in 1804, Polly, the younger daughter, who's now in her 20s, she died. Well, Abigail had a relationship with Polly Jefferson, both in London for a couple weeks when Polly came over by herself to join her father, and then in the early 1790s when Abigail was living in Philadelphia, the capital, when her husband was vice president and Jefferson was Secretary of State. Polly had come to Philadelphia to take some courses for her education. And so Abigail had learned to love Polly. So when Polly died in 1804, Abigail debated whether to contact Jefferson. They had been estranged since 1801 when, as I mentioned, Jefferson defeated John Adams for the presidency. She finally decided she would write, and she wrote, and you will see the letters that they exchanged between each other. I believe there were 4 from her and 3 from him, in which at first she concentrates solely on the personal side, the condolences for the death of Polly. Jefferson's response, she signs, in essence, one who used to call you friend. Jefferson responds on a personal side as well, but then states, I've always loved Mr. Adams and admired him. There's only one thing he did that was irritating to me, and that was the midnight appointment of judges. And he said, well, he felt maybe that wasn't John Adams' responsibility alone, but it was his advisors, not knowing that Abigail was his closest advisor, and Abigail was involved in that. And these were the midnight appointments that what he was talking about was the appointment of federal judges. After the defeat of John Adams in his 3 months of lame duck status, the Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, and that created many new courts and many new appointments of judges. And Abigail and John filled those all the judges, justices of the peace, bailiffs, clerks, etc., like that, with staunch Federalists to try to stop the radical policies of the incoming president and Congress that was controlled by the Jeffersonians. And so Jefferson said that he opposed those appointments by John Adams. Abigail comes to John's defense, and the correspondence focuses heavily on the sedition law and President Jefferson's pardoning of those people who had been convicted under the sedition law. And so those are 7 very interesting letters to see. In many respects, Abigail is serving as a surrogate for her husband in defending the sedition law and the Minutemen appointments as well. Abigail, at home after John's retirement, they suffer somewhat. They lose a lot of their money that had been placed in a London bank when the bank failed. They lost that, so they had to struggle along in their retirement. No pensions at that time for government workers. And so they were financially not terribly stressed, but they had to be economical. And Abigail was a staunch advocate of the economy. Abigail would have preferred to invest their money in government bonds, U.S. government bonds. John preferred land. And so Abigail did not. She felt land was a difficult chore for her to run when John was gone, and it was taxed also. So she preferred government bonds. They would have been better off financially, and they followed Abigail's preference in investing in bonds rather than in land. But retirement was also difficult because she was having physical problems herself. She always had physical problems. She was a sickly person, always had things like rheumatism and fever and headaches. And these things would tie her up, would force her to be bedridden for a week, 2 weeks, a month at a time. Obviously, we know that's not a very good thing to happen nowadays. But she did suffer from these kinds of ailments throughout her entire life. In her retirement, her daughter died. She had one stillborn child. Another child died at 1.5 years old. And then Charlie, their middle boy, died in around 1800 from alcoholism and probably drugs. And a very sad case that was. And then Nabby, their only daughter, Abigail Jr. was her full name, but she was called Nabby. In 1811, she was writing and indicated that she had this pain in her and lump in her breast, and it was diagnosed long distance as cancer. A number of the doctors were given details about Nabby's condition, and Benjamin Rush, for instance, in Philadelphia, said she really needs to have that lump removed. She came back to Boston. She had it removed. She was in a weakened condition for 6 months or so until she was able to go back to upstate New York where she was living. But within 2 years later, the cancer came back, and she struggled valiantly to go back to Braintree, to Quincy, and that's where she died. Abigail was quite distressed, found it difficult to accept the will of God in the death of Nabby. Not only was the death of her daughter a serious blow to Abigail, but the fact that the grandchildren had lost a mother, Abigail's grandchildren had lost a mother, was difficult for Abigail to accept. Her uncle, Cotton Tufts, who was very close, died at this time, and her sister, Mary Cranch, and Richard Cranch also died at this time. So this was a very difficult time for Abigail. Eventually, in 1818, Abigail died in her sleep of typhoid fever. She had struggled a great deal in these last years, and she I think, was in a way relieved that she died. John goes on and lives another 8 years. He dies in 1826. But Abigail Adams was a very special person. Uh, she was the wife of a president, mother of another president, a very special person in her own right. She had opinions. It's interesting to see what she said about other folks at the time, people like Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, uh, John Paul Jones. She had opinions about everybody, and it's fascinating to see what she had to say. She was a very special person, and she understood the need for protections for women, which makes her especially important in this 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. She was a staunch advocate for the rights of everyone, men and women, black and white. She was a special American.